Fantastic. Okay, so yeah, I was very happy to be invited to speak here today, because obviously figurations is the central part of my research. And yeah, as Marta mentioned, I'm coming to the end of my doctoral thesis, and so what I'm going to present today is some, not all, but some of the conclusions or the ideas that I've worked through during this last 4 years. So my presentation today is titled Reconstructing the Civilizing Process, the Church, the Witch, and the Woman. And it's going to consist of 3 sections. So I'm firstly going to take us on a kind of little journey back into the medieval context for the civilizing process, because essentially what I'm trying to do is analyze whether or not the civilizing process will still apply if we take a more gendered approach to historical sociology, as well as considering the role of religion in this transition. So I'm going to firstly look at the medieval context for both of those, then move us into the early modern period, which is roughly like the mid 15th century to the mid 18th century, and look at some early modern witchcraft prosecutions. I am restricting my analysis mostly to England and Scotland, because that's where I've done the majority of my fieldwork, but obviously it does apply to kind of other areas of Europe as well. And then I'm going to kind of consider the decline and of the prosecutions, and also what I have kind of tentatively suggested is a religious decentralization process, which is part of this reconstruction of the civilizing process that I'm kind of proposing. So the fantastic thing about speaking today, I probably don't need to explain too much about Elias and the civilizing process. So just briefly to talk about where I've come from theoretically. So I'm focusing mostly on Elias's 1939 originally published Civilizing Process book. Obviously, it's translated into English in 1979, which is when it really takes off. But I think it's quite pertinent to that particular time period as to why he wrote it then. And very simplistically speaking, he described the development of European society from the medieval period to the modern period through 2 interlinking elements, psychogenesis and sociogenesis. So the psychogenesis referring to the more the transformation in behavior and interactional relations and manners in particular, and violence as being characteristic of the medieval, compared with a more restrained, less violent society of the modern period. Now, I originally started my doctoral thesis looking at just the witchcraft prosecutions in terms of whether or not you could see that as a decivilizing process, like a small decivilizing process, because it takes place in the early modern period, not medieval, which surprises a lot of people. But in that period where Elias is really describing state formation. And so I was interested in why is this violent kind of form of social violence and institutional violence happening in this period in particular. But when I was kind of investigating it, I realized that actually I needed to kind of consider the question of religion deeply involved in this topic, because of course it is fundamentally a violent process, but it's based on various different elements of religious institutions and the relationship between the two. So that was one thing. And the second thing, again, coming from a historical background, which is my kind of master's degree was in social history, One of the big things, and I'm not the first person to mention this, and Marta's written some fascinating work on gender relations and interactional strategies. But my question was, does the civilizing process even apply to women in the same way? And women in the medieval period in particular, from my knowledge of medieval society, I couldn't quite square this idea of unrestrained, violent interactional strategies if you consider women as the kind of primary unit of analysis, which I think is obviously perfectly valid given it's half the population. So what I was interested in then is, obviously we've got to look at civilizing process from this perspective. And so I went a bit further back into the medieval period. And to do that, I went back to Norbert Elias's own point of departure, which was when he was looking at the medieval conduct books as his primary evidence for that transition in the sociogenesis. And obviously the conduct books that he particularly selected were mainly Erasmus and various other conduct books aimed at educating young boys into courtly society. And I understand why he did that, because of course it was a primarily patriarchal society in many different ways. But I was interested in seeing, okay, could you do the same thing if you take the conduct books directed at women, of which there are some examples. And interestingly, what I found was actually, if you look at the conduct books describing women's behavior and interactions, they situate women as being far more restrained behaviorally and interactionally and emotionally at a much earlier stage than men, their kind of contemporaries. And if we look at, for example, this first example from a German text where it's talking in the 13th century. So it says, "We women now have more masters than moderation owes us. Only the best men once wielded its rod, but now the rod of many a man, who himself lacks all virtue, falls upon us. It troubles me that such a man, who cannot measure even 3 feet appropriately, wants to measure the pure life of women with his feeble criteria. There is too much of this mastery." Now, I think it's a fascinating text, this one, and it's really kind of evocative, and I'm sure many women will kind of feel a connection with this. But what I think is really important is that it's highlighting the fact that women in this period are seen as virtuous. Their behavior is much more restrained. If we look at the next part, it says, "No matter how things stand with men's inconstancy, we women should be even more constant and bear enmity towards men who do not exercise self-restraint towards us." So what we're really seeing in this period is the self-restraint embodied by women already fully established by the 13th century, and acting as a kind of coercive or encouragement towards using these external forces of coercion towards men. And I think part of the reason why this has occurred, there is this divide between the genders with regards to behavioral strategy, is the patriarchal nature of medieval society. So these interactional strategies have been established in a male to female power relationship at an earlier stage than the men who are having to then do it to other men in courtly society. And I think we can see that in, for example, when we talk about the next bit, where there's a double standard of behavior is expected of women. So while among men drunkenness is bad, it's even more vulgar for women. And then in this 15th century English version, talking about what you should do if you get married. And really interestingly, it's talking about a and so may you keep him in a good mood and be his darling. Pleasing and meek word can slake anger, my dear child. You should be pleasing of speech, happy and in mild mood. So again, it's this kind of self-restraint of emotion and behavior in order to interact with your kind of male, who is quite clearly more unrestrained and likely to become angry. And again, at this last version, if it happens that she needs to cry for some reason, she should cry without a sound. So what we are really seeing is a much more a higher expectation amongst women than men with regards to this concept of kind of psychogenesis. And I think that's really important, because that transition then pushes women's psychogenesis kind of 2 centuries before men. So something happens then in that interaction between the two, which we need to kind of pick apart. I was also then interested in, okay, that's one of the complaints that people have with Elias's civilizing process. It's very top down. Does this still apply if we look at the rest of the population? And so I was interested in the concept of violence, and does violence in medieval society still have this gendered element? And in terms of the concept of declining violence, if we look at the 14th century homicide data, which is probably the most accurate way that we can measure violent crime. It's not perfect, and obviously there will be gaps in the record, but it's the most kind of consistently reported of the crimes. And so what I find really interesting is if we look at the 14th century, yes, we have a big decrease in the number of homicides, looking specifically in England. So it goes from 5.2 to 3.6 per 10,000 in England, versus in 2019, 0.15 per 10,000. Big drop in violent homicide. In the 14th century, again, supports Elias's argument, 84% of the urban homicides stem from arguments. Most of those are in public, and they are not between family members. So it is a kind of violent interactional space. Absolutely. But if we dig a little bit more into the data, what we can see actually is that if we look at the proportion of female victims of homicide, 8% in the early 14th century versus 24% in the 21st century. So we've got a threefold increase in women as victims of homicide since the medieval period. Now, the reason I haven't mentioned women as perpetrators is there's basically one example that I found of a woman committing murder. It's just not reported at all. And I traced this data through to the 18th century, every 50 years or so, and found, again, it's a similar kind of distribution, gentle trend that drastically increases in the early modern period because of the concept of witchcraft. So lots and lots of people, if you remove witchcraft from the murder stats, it's a nice kind of standard curve. But if you leave it in according to their version of murder, it looks a bit different. Anyway, so so the proportion of violence towards women is getting worse in this context. And I think part of the reason why that's happening is if you look at the percentage of murders related to family members in the 14th century, it's only 8%. And I think, again, this is related to most murders are happening outside the home, they're happening out in public spaces, compared with 53% in modern context. So you've got, again, a transition from public violence into the private spaces, which is where this violence against women appears to be proliferating. So again, this comes back then to this overall picture, as I've described, of medieval society bearing a slightly different relationship between violence and behavior for men and women. So according to Woodbridge, it says the essentialist gender theory of the age, males were aggressive by nature and only men could legitimately commit violence. To commit violence was to be not female, and to be not female was to commit violence, which I think is a really interesting conception, because what it implies that perhaps psychogenesis is a gendered phenomenon in the Elysian version. So I was then interested in looking at, okay, what happened? Why is this the case if we move into the early modern period? Oh, pardon me. So the second part of my analysis that I was interested in, I'm definitely not the first person to ask the question of where is religion in Elias's work. I can see Stephen Mennell, he's definitely answered this question partially in his work with Linklater, and Kolsblum talked about it as well. But again, coming from the social history perspective, I was really interested with the role of the church, the medieval church, in the kind of civilizing process, because medieval church in many ways acted like a kind of proto-state in itself. It has kind of entered into various different stages of its own civilizing process. It had a well-established taxation system. It had a church court system, which was kind of more effective than the smaller states and kingdoms, which were which made up most of society. In the 12th to the 13th century, the Gregorian reform movement really expands the power of the church and kind of pulls it into overlap with the heads of states themselves, the monarchs. So it's a real rival power structure that exists in the medieval period in similar ways that the later state formation of the kind of early modern period starts to appear. So I was interested then, why, what does this possibly suggest that civilizing process or state formation process could have happened with a theocratic state if it had carried on in this particular direction? And I personally think yes. And I think also this is what the monarchs knew. This is why Gregorian reform movement happened. It was a fight between him and the Holy Roman Emperor. So there's these two elements. Then we've got kind of a violent society in which women are kind of acting as a kind of almost they're kind of leading the way in terms of psychogenesis. At the same time, the medieval church is kind of leading the way in sociogenesis, and the monarch and the state are really kind of being left behind. So if we move then to the early modern period, what do we see happening instead? There's a consensus among historians that, by the end of the 17th century, so really starting in the 15th, ending in the 17th, women's status drastically decreases in society. There's a huge shift in the attitudes towards women as they kind of enter into more public spaces. There's a kind of resurgence of laws surrounding women and regulating women in various different ways. At the same time, this period is undergoing this massive transition in terms of religious reformation and religious conflict. So even in places which didn't go through a full reformatory process, there was still fragmentation. There was still huge amounts of kind of undermining of those medieval church systems at the same time. And one of my kind of proposed solutions for the reason why witchcraft in itself had to appear, or appeared, I shouldn't say had to, it could not have, but it appeared in this particular way, was the necessity for these kind of emergent patriarchal states to redefine women within the violent framework that they are most familiar with utilizing in the court system. And the way to do this, when there is no kind of evidence of female violence increasing, is to invent one, which is in the sense of witchcraft, and witchcraft being associated primarily with murder. And that's why we start to see this huge jump in the number of homicides associated with women as being committed by them and also against them through witchcraft. So yeah, in many ways then, the witchcraft trials are symptomatic of various different early modern processes that are happening from kind of the 15th century to the 18th century. And these, it ends up being kind of an interesting lens by which we can look at those two elements of when reconsidering the civilizing process. So in kind of my primary analysis of the witchcraft prosecutions, instead of looking at the trials themselves, what I actually did was look at these things called witchcraft pamphlets. So these were essentially small documents that were printed en masse, nationwide circulation, that were a little bit like news articles, sensationalized documents that told the stories of kind of interesting news or various different polemical approaches as well. But many of them contain specific examples related to witchcraft trials. So I've got one on the right here, which describes a very infamous trial that happened in Leicestershire. And the reason I wanted to look at those in particular was that it was in a way, an example of kind of the behavioral modification and exertion of social norms upon the population, because as you follow the pamphlets developing across the period, you can see the kind of consolidation of these ideas around witchcraft. And the justification of the witchcraft trials themselves, and the justification of the violence perpetrated, and various different regulatory elements. So inside the kind of rising concept of the witch, then, what we really start to see in the early modern period is the idea that a witch is demonic. And that was something that was really missing from the medieval version of witches, and it's why the witchcraft prosecutions don't really begin until the 15th century, because suddenly it is individuals who have made a decision to make a deal, a pact with the devil, and so have entered into a voluntary relationship with the ultimate kind of outsider, if we're looking at these established outsider relations. So it's a person within a community who is not obviously demonic. They take a great care to find signs of witchcraft, but it's not obvious. And there are all sorts of power negotiations that go on between individuals. This is all happening at the same time as the church, this in England and Scotland, as their responsibility has been kind of fractured by Reformation processes, where previously the church would step in for a charity and aid towards kind of older members of society or vulnerable members of society. That's no longer well established, and they're starting to break down. So we see a rise in poverty in real terms across this period. What I find really interesting about witches themselves is that they have a long-standing reputation. They're not tried at the first offence. They're tried after 20, 30, sometimes 50 years of having a reputation for witchcraft. So it's a really strong established outsider relationship that's going on. They're known about. There are kind of the idea that witchcraft can be passed down Obviously, each generation has to sign their own deal with the devil, but you're much more likely to if your grandmother is a witch or your daughter's a witch. And also witchcraft itself is a learned practice. So there's this kind of notion that witchcraft is something that you participate in, and it highlights and represents the ultimate kind of negative behavioral negative behaviors of women in this period. So if we look at, for example, here, this is an account of a man interacting with a witch in 1592, where he says, meeting her near his master's barn and giving her the time of day, like a perverse woman, like a perilous wasp, like a pesteous witch, incensed with hate at the sight of him, held down her head, not deigning to speak. So interestingly, he's having a kind of interaction where a woman's refusing to engage in social communication or relations with him, and is actually kind of behaving in a kind of very demure way towards him, which is being re-examined in relation to her being a witch. Is the kind of thing she's not entering into expected behavioral patterns of male-female interaction. So there are kind of two elements that, analysing the witchcraft pamphlets, there are various different ways that you can see both the presence of kind of localised social regulation, but also the presence of what we could refer to as charismatic individuals. And this kind of context between the two driving the direction of the witchcraft prosecutions. So fundamentally, witches are unneighbourly. They behave in ways where they're causing problems for neighbours, they're causing conflict, they're expecting too much from the kind of balance of gift giving and exchange. Kinship relations are often strained as well. So they are kind of the ultimate nightmare. Generally speaking, witches are not particularly pleasant members of the society, and they're described as such by their neighbours. Cursing and threatening, so that's very key. Often the evidence that's used against a witch is that she cursed and she threatened to cause harm in some way, and then harm happens maybe in a slightly different way, but the idea that she intentionally was bringing violence to an individual was deeply important. And so are the motivations for witchcraft. And this is really interesting because the motivations themselves are really, really small. They are things like a woman asked for bread in charity from a neighbor, and the neighbor gave her 2-day-old bread instead of today's bread. And that's viewed as motivation for her to commit an act of violence against him. So it's looking both in the kind of regulation of obviously the witch's behavior as being generally bad, but also neighborly relations need to be kind of re-established. And the reason why individuals kind of bring these accusations to trial is they feel bad for doing something. They were thinking about it. Oh, why did my cow die the next day? Oh, well, it happened because I didn't give her the best bread. So there is this kind of element of awareness of kind of unneighborly behavior on both sides. At the same time, we do have these charismatic individuals who are kind of bringing excuse me, so whose involvement in the trials really changes the direction of them. So we've got some witches themselves who are kind of unrepentantly accepting of their identity as witches and driving kind of chaos in various different ways, but they are not the majority. And then we have the occasional witch finders, whose job it is, like Matthew Hopkins in this picture, to really provide evidence for the prosecution, but it ends up being a job in which they make a lot of, well, they don't make a lot of money, but they make their living doing this. And people like Matthew Hopkins were kind of fanatics about prosecuting witches. And then the prosecutors themselves, some of them have deep impacts. Matthew Hale is a particular example where he prosecuted witches in Pendle on the evidence of children, 9-year-olds and 11-year-olds, and the rest of society, English society, said that's ridiculous. How could you do that? He kind of produced a big document justifying it, but generally speaking, his attitude was treated as, well, this has gone too far. But his then his process and kind of justification was used by the prosecutors in Salem in Massachusetts. So there is a direct kind of transformation of the witchcraft prosecutions in a different place. So yes. So what does this really have to do with the kind of monopoly of violence and the state formation processes? Well, the interesting thing about the witch prosecutions is that it's really at the forefront of the battle between the church and the state for jurisdiction. So until really the end of the 16th century, witchcraft prosecutions are a religious crime. And then in the 16th century, that's when they start, they are all kind of almost at the same time brought into a secular crime with biblical justification. And really what's that kind of says is that the monarch is now in charge of saving you from devil. The monarch is now in charge of your soul. The monarch is trying to help you. The church has failed in some way. And what's kind of happening in that transition period, there are priests involved in that in the early stages, but they're phased out in England in particular. However, in Scotland, where the Reformation process didn't fully become enacted, and was kind of there was always a weaker negotiation between the church and the state, the ministers continued to prosecute and sometimes did the mass witchcraft prosecutions, and actually ended up creating a bit of a problem for the monarch, because these independent clergy were acting as kind of lawmen, vaguely under the sanctioning of the state, but not really. So why does the excuse me, why is it important then for the states to take over the concept of witchcraft? Well, witchcraft is being associated with murder, and if you're going to if you need to monopolize violence, you need to stop murders happening. And it's kind of it would be a mistake to say that they didn't believe in witchcraft at this particular period. They absolutely believed that witches were capable of murder, and what they have done is associated witchcraft and murder with kind of the negative intentions of women in particular, who are kind of being subjected to this reduced status and various other processes happening at the same time. Now, we also see here a problem in the sense that the violent legal process surrounding witches, even in England, where we didn't torture people, there was still a lot of violence involved in every stage of processing witchcraft in a way that other crimes, except maybe heresy, weren't. This is kind of in balance with the rise in vigilantism towards witches in particular. So there are points where the violent legal process has to occur in order to suppress the vigilante element of society. So some villages are taking it upon themselves to test whether a witch is a witch by throwing her into a pond. And the state has to come in and say, actually, it's murder if you throw her in and she dies. And so kind of have to intercede at various different points, but in a more violent way that suppresses kind of the angry mob. Now, what we can generally see there, though, is that kind of fight between the state, the people, and the church. But areas where it goes particularly wrong in this period are where we start to see the mass prosecutions. And this is where we have huge numbers of witchcraft trials happening in the same time. And this, in general, can be almost exactly patterned with periods of political and social upheaval. And if we look at the graph, so this is a graph of the entire period when witch prosecutions were legal in Scotland. And almost every spike in witchcraft trials is associated with a form either of religious conflict or political conflict or social conflict, but mostly all of them mixed together. So the mass prosecutions are kind of happening in those spaces where the centralized state mechanisms are at its weakest. And this can be kind of seen in the idea that it's a long reformation. The state has not fully separated from the church. The church itself has not fully separated from kind of Catholic ideas. And obviously war and external factors weaken this idea of state solidarity, essentially. So if we then move to really the early 18th century, which is kind of when we're seeing full state formation, this is roughly when the witchcraft trials have stopped. They're made illegal in Britain in 1736, but really at that point, they hadn't really tried anyone for about 30 years. And part of this is that witchcraft is no longer a real concern for the establishment, for the politicians, which are now in a period of complete separation from the church. The church are desperately trying to get back involved, but they are being kind of pushed out in various different ways. And this was a kind of symbolic way to say that we are no longer associated with religious involvement. And the British repeal kind of is almost mocking, because it talks about witchcraft is illegal if you're pretending to be a witch. So it's and it becomes an element of kind of repression of religious ideals, and at the same time telling the rest of the population not to believe, even though they did, and they continued. And I think the last person to be lynched for witchcraft in England was in 1913. So it obviously isn't something that disappeared completely. So in kind of conclusion then, what I think we've kind of seen happening by the end of this period really is that concept that I mentioned at the start of this religious decentralization process. So it doesn't disappear from our lives, the concept of religion or belief, but it has to become decentralized in order for the rest of the state to develop fully. So I'm kind of proposing it is a third pillar of the state formation, alongside the tax, the concept of taxation and monopoly of violence. The closer that religion gets to the state functioning, the more likely it is to act as a rival power, unless it's fully incorporated, and then you have a theocratic state. So that's one of the elements. The witchcraft trials themselves, they're kind of representing that battleground between the two, where we're at a period where it's not fully decided in which direction it's going. And at the same time, the role of women is being renegotiated. Women as kind of non-violent actors is being reframed into, yes, they can do violence, they are capable, it's not fundamentally female to be non-violent and self-restrained, and that's fully established by the 18th century. And you can see that actually reflected in the rise in the number of crimes committed by women, although always they are less violent than their male counterparts. So yes, thank you very much for your attention, and yes, happy to take any questions if you have any.